and using surveys to map is important. So if I could just ask for some further reflection on that as we go through. I also see there are press notices going out on medical doctors' degrees, medical education degrees, which I think is terrific. I'm so pleased with the work that has been done on this. But I also think the medical associates programme is also hugely significant, and I've not seen anything that says we're putting anything out on medical associates. So I think we should be describing the range of reforms that we're introducing in their totality. And I would just ask that further weight, further thought is given to comms on the medical associates programme, which talks about anaesthetic assistants, etc. We'll come on to, I think, comms again after we've done item 7, which is the slide pack presentation that we're going to go through. But my apologies. As I say, I thought I'd prepared well for this committee. Well, I had prepared well for this committee, but my notes have disappeared as the change in papers came through. Navina, you had your hand up to come back to me on the staff survey.
Yes, actually, it's me or Vicky. We do have plans, David, to make sure we get meaningful engagement, especially focused on the issues to do with transition. And we thought we would take it to the People and Culture Committee for further discussion and for scrutiny. Vicky, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, exactly that. So I totally get the challenge and the ask for continuity. And in fact, Navina, it's very much what you said to me when we had this discussion on numerous occasions. And I'd like to give some assurance that we will rethink this. Well, we will, think again and go around this thinking loop. We're working with an external company called ETS, and we're asking them what is the very best way to really get under the skin of the data that we already have and get fresh data on how our colleagues are feeling in this transition. And we've got a 3-fold plan to do that, which I think it might be useful for me to share earlier than the People and Culture Committee to get some scrutiny ahead of September. So I can happy to do that in the exec forum, and perhaps Sir David and Andrew as chair of the People Committee. Perhaps we could jump on a call about that. I'm happy to go into that detail now, but I don't think that's what you're asking.
No, I'm not. I was just using this opportunity to invite a rethink rather than open up for the conversation. Maybe it's just me, but I do think being able to build trend lines on staff engagement and mental well-being is hugely important, particularly as we go through quite a significant change. And that's my point. And there's a whole bunch of work we've got that is being undertaken now that will go into the new organisation. So not doing it because we're going into the new organisation it doesn't wash its face for me. But you come back as you've suggested, Vicky, and I'm fine with that. And Andrew, I know will track this through the People Committee as we go forward as well. So I'm very confident of you doing that in that way. OK, right, let's bring that to a close. And sorry, colleagues, for me dragging you back. I hope I don't do that again. So I think we come now to item 7, which is the education and training reforms. We've got 50 minutes for this, and we also need to take the finance and planning conversations as well. So I'm not looking for long presentations from Wendy and Mark on this, please. Please take it that we've read the papers and we've digested them as well. But let me invite you to introduce the papers.
Thank you. I'm kicking off and then my trusty colleague Mark will follow on. And I think what we want to do is just to, having had an in-depth discussion at a board development session, we want to sort of highlight the areas and try and come back with some of the responses to the really helpful discussion we had at that time. So I'll just pop the slides up just in case people haven't got them in front of them. There we go. Should be coming up now. Maybe not. I think it's appearing now, so I will kick off anyway. Right, here we go. So the context for this report is really to update the board in the areas of reform, focused primarily for this purpose around medicine and nursing. But the context is, of course, the whole workforce. And we were asked to prepare quite a lot of this work for colleagues in the department for submission to a white paper. One white paper was on reform, the other was on health inequalities. And obviously with the change in ministers, we're waiting to hear where that work will sit. But this is quite well advanced work. And I think the question that we'd like to ask both Mark and I is the same as Richard Meddings. So what more and what pace and what difference will this reform make? The context is always changing, as we know, but professional reform is the work of years. And all of this work in the medical space builds on the big publication we had in 2019 of Future Doctor, which was a consultative document across the medical profession and others, where we asked, what will a doctor be doing in 30 years? What professional skills will they need? What attributes? What values? And we worked back from there to start to shape what reforms we need to put in place in education and training. And of course, Future Doctor didn't arise from nothing. It arose from years of Enhancing Junior Doctors' Working Lives reports, which in itself arose from the really quite challenging context of industrial action from doctors in training. So I pay tribute to my colleagues in my team who have worked both at the business delivery, getting doctors into post, getting them assessed, getting them trained, and all the flexibilities that we've put in over the years. And if I was to encapsulate Enhancing Junior Doctors' Working Lives, it's the process of training, and the reform agenda is the shape and product for the future of training. So the medical reforms, and you've got the details in each of the annex slides, but primarily we focus on undergraduate and postgraduate reform. And I would suggest that one of the challenges that Navina has made to us is, and what about the rest of the medical profession? Where does that sit as we go into a new organisation? And that's a really exciting opportunity. Because for me, it's always felt rather odd that my responsibilities stop at the moment someone gets a CCT. It isn't a transition point that we should stop anything at. It should be the start of something. And likewise, we know from doctors that they're stepping in and out of training more often. And we value that because they are the workforce that drives the NHS 24/7. How do we make sure that that experience is recognised and counted so that the product from training isn't just the conveyor belt, but is also the product at each stage of training? And this is where I pay tribute to the work that Shona McLeod has been leading on the training recovery. Training recovery and the impact of the pandemic has accelerated not only our thinking, but our collaboration and our product in terms of reform. So, for example, we recruited using electronic tools, not face-to-face, 400 consultants in a building in London recruiting doctors. We moved from that to an electronic system. How are we maximising that efficiency for the future? More controversially, doctors progressed without their Royal College postgraduate examinations and have been providing safe care because we have checked through their assessments. So what's the role of examinations and how do we make them really relevant in 30 years' time? And the colleges have been instrumental in the joint work we've done on the reforms based on the training recovery programme. And some of the products from that are, at the beginning of this conversation, we had around 14% of our doctors in training requiring significantly extra time. So stopping the pipeline. How would we meet the recovery for surgery if we don't have surgeons trained? That has now come down to around 6%, and I suspect we'll settle at a lower level than that. And we normally run at around 2 to 3% of extra time needed for all trainees. So by looking at individual training requirements, by personalising training and making the offer for catching up in a different way, using technology, using all sorts of different modalities, we can make an impact. And that impact will now be felt in traditional training or regular training routes, not just in catch-up. And for those of you that were able to attend NHS Confederation, we heard a really compelling story from a young surgical trainee who had had COVID twice and suffered with long COVID for a period of time. He was in his final years as a vascular surgeon. I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning that he was in the armed forces, so he has proven resilience. And he highlighted the fact that he could practice his surgical procedures with his boss, with his surgical boss, his trainer and his consultant on a cadaver and gain his confidence back and go back into the acute service where he did the same operation a week later. And his trainer had the confidence to let him do that. So training is not just about the technical challenges, it's about the confidence to perform your competencies. And I think that we've learned a huge amount from the COVID recovery. That blended learning approach has led to us thinking about what else we could do with that. And Mark will talk more about some of the blended learning opportunities in nursing. The other big challenge in medicine is what's the offer that medical education makes to reduce health disparities? What's our role in that? Yes, we have the content of curricula, but that primarily comes from our colleagues in colleges regulated by the GMC, although we do influence it. And we looked at the distribution of our postgraduate training programs in the light of the establishment of the 5 new medical schools in areas of great deprivation. We've worked closely with the CMO and indeed, again, tribute to Adrian Brooks, who supported Sir Chris Whitty's report into coastal regions. Patrick and his team have got a really good program looking at areas of less active health engagement, I think is the way to put it. And we looked at where we actually offer training and fund it. And that distribution conversation would show that we're heavily skewed to some areas of the country. And we've looked at this in detail in 3 specialties. This is joint work that we've done with our colleagues in NHS E&I, chaired by Adrian Brooks and Aidan Fowler. And this is challenging because moving our training resource is going to change the shape of training, but it does seem unreasonable that we don't look at the areas of the country that need doctors and train there as well. This is a big, long programme. It's a 5 to 10 year programme. And part of the conversations we've been having with colleagues in NHS E&I is how we protect this programme as we come together and merge. The next big element of health inequalities is training doctors who are better able to manage the multiple comorbidities that increasingly patients will present with, particularly in what's called the undifferentiated take. So those people appearing in an A&E setting, community setting, or maybe in their specialist setting, but with multiple comorbidities. And that generalist approach is really, it's a massive challenge globally for doctors. We tested out some of the concepts around generalism in Future Doctor, and what we learned was that nobody wants to be a generalist in a world that values specialists. What we learned from COVID was that the skills of doctoring, those professional and generalist medical skills, were highly valued. And therefore, we're running a series of trailblazers, testing out elements of a generalism program that is population-based, geographically based, that will allow doctors to feel part of a community of healthcare, community of social care, and a community of learning. And focused primarily on the first 5 years of postgraduate learning, where we know doctors want flexibility, they want to enhance their generalist skills, they want to make sure that they're good doctors, they also want to progress in their chosen specialty if they have chosen it, but have the flexibility to move into a different specialty if it's not a good fit. This programme will enhance all of those opportunities. And we've launched the Trailblazers. And again, this is a programme that we would want to look at carefully as we move into the new world. And then finally, the space around the numbers and the new ways into medicine. Having had the successful establishment of 5 new medical schools, all of whom are taking a very active approach in widening participation, as are many of our other traditional medical schools. We've looked previously at prior learning. So can somebody who's been a pharmacist, a physiotherapist, a nurse, who might want to do medicine, how can they transfer in? At the moment, the regulations are very rigid, and we've been working with colleagues in the GMC and across the 4 countries to look at prior learning as a way of accelerating undergraduate medicine. And out of that came the apprenticeship reforms that both Navina and Sir David have paid tribute to earlier in the board meeting. Apprenticeship is not quicker than traditional medicine, but it is different. And I think the way I'd encapsulate it just briefly is that this is the first time that the NHS, in terms of a place, a hospital, a trust, has direct influence over how we produce doctors. So the influence has been tangential with clinical placements for many, many years. But this person will be working in your organisation. How is that going to change the sort of doctor we produce? It's a really exciting offer. And I'm very grateful to the chief executive colleagues, including Sir Julian Hartley, who've supported this and helped us shape this. It's a very exciting offer. And the medical profession is supportive, and we will continue to make sure we engage with them. There are always going to be challenges to selection and all of these sort of things with this, but it's a massive opportunity to change the dynamic of a single degree process to produce the doctors of the future. So I'll hand over to Mark briefly, and then I think you've got the rest of the slides in the detail of what I've said in the appendix. Mark.
Brilliant, thanks, Wendy. Do we want to drop the slides? I mean, because the details of the pack, I've just kind of do some remarks just to follow on from Wendy. So I think it's really important framing that actually healthcare is often about teams, whether you're delivering that in people's homes or in social care or a hospital or a general practice setting. The nature of teams has always been an inherent part of that. So importantly, how nurses, allied health professions, psychologists, scientists interact with each other is a really important part of any reform that we do. And of course, the bigger strategic question is much of the reform that we set out, some of it is very much realisable in the near term in terms of the opportunities that brings to deliver services differently to communities and patients. But actually, in some cases, those reforms lead to, I would say, downstream mid to long term changes. I've been qualified as a nurse 28 years now. And, that is, the change that I've seen in clinical practice is enormous. And so the kind of education and training that I had those many, many years ago has to be able to build upon the fact that actually the clinical environment and the range of opportunities that we need to deliver services and the expectations on clinicians have to be built into that sort of programme. So whilst for some across professions, reform is often seen as a challenging word, actually it is about continuous improvement. It is about innovation. It is about advancement and also importantly, modernisation. These are really key underpinning elements of why reform is always necessary, to think about the opportunities to deliver services differently through education and training, not only in the near term, but the longer term. As the paper set out, nursing has been on that journey for a number of years and decades. Now, whether that's the post-92 move into universities, whether that's through advanced practice, through greater specialisation, through CPD, but fundamentally, had the nurses being trained today been trained the way I was 28 years ago, actually they wouldn't be ready to deliver the services that we want to do. So that kind of framing is really important in how we see healthcare, which is the work Joe Lenihan's been leading on Framework 15 across the system. Then that links to both the team and the professional and service vision that we're outlining, and therefore the interventions that we need to apply to that problem in terms of how do we prepare people now for work in 20, 30 years time as a nurse of the future. So there's some really important features of this that I think are really worth doing. Now, the paper goes into some detail. We know we've been doing work around training and education at undergraduate level. We've been looking at changes, particularly in terms of entry routes and widening access and participation through things like nursing associates. There is the future nurse standards we've been doing with our colleagues at the NMC, which are the absolutely fundamental building blocks for that future generation of practice that are going to move away from technical skill actually to knowledge adaptation, because actually the technical skills are only going to flow based upon innovation and change we see through things like digital, through pharma changes, through surgical technique. Actually, it's about how do people in practice use their knowledge and capability to inform how they do their job, whether that's in a community setting, person's home, or in a hospital. So we've got a further reform package that we're putting forward about how do we develop and refine the curriculum in particular. A real focus, as an example, we've got Roehampton University that actually has designed an undergraduate nursing programme that has a community and general practice focus predominantly, again reflecting what we are going to see in services. So we've got real partnership across the regulator with Nursing Midwifery Council, our universities in terms of approaches to innovation and design, and one of those is, of course, the blended learning degree, which is again really driving innovation about how we teach, the knowledge and capability to again give the service across health and social care the requirements in terms of people who are really thinking about what knowledge capability brings them in terms of the ability to deliver services in a very, very different way, leveraging all of the opportunity we see around things like enhanced practice, advanced practice, the capabilities of teamwork, the use of different approaches in terms of service design and delivery in different ways. I was trained predominantly in hospitals, actually, but the majority of care is probably more than likely going to be delivered in people's homes, community and general practice settings. So giving people the ability to move and transition in those and pick up new skills and capability, building upon already the existing knowledge and expertise we have in those systems, is going to be a really important feature. And I'll kind of finish on the fact that actually the team of the community, the team of general practice in the future, through these reforms, is going to look fundamentally different to the perhaps traditions that we've seen when I first qualified as a nurse. So it is a really exciting future, but reform shouldn't be a challenge. It should be, for me, about that continuous improvement, innovation, advancement and modernisation to deliver services better for our communities. Thanks, colleagues. I'm, of course, really happy to open up the debate, views, thoughts, challenging questions.
Wendy, Mark, thanks for that. We have had a run at this report in the board development session. So the reason we wanted to bring this report here is because we needed to make it a public statement of our ambition for reform, which is what I think this report does incredibly well. And I think when it comes to comms, I know we're going to do some comms on medical apprenticeships, and that's absolutely right and proper. But there's lots of material here that I think needs to be made broadly available across the health and care system, and particularly to ICBs. And I don't know whether you'd agree, Andrew Morris, to the new NHS England board as well, because I think it is an agenda that is setting out reform. And Mark, I thought your framing around continuous improvement, innovation and modernisation was a really helpful way to begin this, that actually change is something we should embrace, not be frightened of, whilst recognising there are anxieties about change, and therefore we need to hold both of those realities as we begin to make the argument. And I think setting it out in the way that you both have is incredibly helpful. In case I forget in the summing up, I would like us to think, Navina and Lee, about what comms needs to come out of this more broadly. Not just the medical apprenticeships. That's not to diminish the medical apprenticeships at all. But it is, there's a really set of important stories here. And I think the slides which do the summary on medical reform and clinical reforms are very powerful, actually, if you're just capturing it in a very concerted way. But let me I'm going to squeeze the back end of our agenda as we go to 1:30, because I think it's important we give this a bit more time, but it's also important we then connect what is said in this set of slides with what Callum and his team are going to take us through when it comes to the money, because I want to build on an integrated approach to planning, of which finance, workforce and service planning come out. And that's where I want to end up at about quarter to one or so, before we go into the last part of the agenda. So let me just try and get this in the order. Andrew Foster, please.
Yeah, so part of my daily routine is to start off by reading the Roy Lilly daily news, and what's portrayed in that is something which is held to be a truth in parts of the workforce, that there are less nurses in training, less doctors in training, doctors are leaving this country, that Health Education England sits on its hands and watches this and does nothing. And really nothing could be further from the truth. And this set of papers here really illustrates beautifully the energy that has gone into reform and capacity increase that has been happening. And there are more doctors in training, there are more nurses in training, not enough, I grant you, but there are more. And that's not what people generally recognise. So I think, David, you were talking about a comms approach here. I think it really would be helpful if we had a sort of facts of the workforce comms that we could get out. I agree with highlighting things like apprenticeships and many of the other very valuable schemes, but just some of the basics about what's really happening seems to be not known to the chatterati.
Well said, Andrew. Well said. This is why during the time I've been involved with HEE, I keep repeating the point about comms, and you've actually made the point beautifully, I think. Andrew Morris, please.
Thanks, David. So this is a great report. There's some really big changes within it. I'm just trying to think how we can best influence the ICS chief execs as they sit down and work through their workforce plans for next year, around how can we connect some of these changes in here with the reality of, influencing their workforce plans going forward. So the comms is really important, but I think pitching this so that, ICS chief execs and chairs really understand what we're trying to do here in helping them, I think it's a really, really important dimension that we need to kind of follow through with some vigor and pace, because there are some fantastic reforms here and we don't want them to go to waste. So we need to kind of, convert them into the reality of workforce planning for next year and onwards.
Again, a really powerful point, I think, about the narrative about what work is being undertaken. Soraya, please.
Thank you. Wendy and Mark, I think, really comprehensive set of slides, and I think some really exciting stuff there that we can start to see fruition. I think the ICB, ICS link has already, those points have been made, but I do think actually they're critical, especially in the areas where you've got the new medical schools, where in fact HEE I think can really facilitate those discussions and help strengthen any of the pilots going forward. One aspect though, I think Wendy, you mentioned it, and Mark, you mentioned Roehampton. It's was very interesting on the visit that Sir David and I did, was understanding actually individuals that are now coming into nursing. They weren't for example, at Roehampton for their new programme, they weren't the traditional. They were people that already had a bit of a career or had already had qualifications elsewhere. But their real ambition, passion and drive to come into nursing was around primary care and what differences they could make. So similarly, the generalist programme that we're looking at for medicine, I just think it's so critical to understand what the trainees want and how we can actually ensure that we meet their needs so that we keep them in the system and we don't go into that spiral of burnout, frustration and things not happening. So there's that trainee piece, I think, that would be really important that we capture. And again, Wendy, I think around medical trainee, you know, the flexible trainee, the run-through trainee programs, they are so critical and, you know, for individuals to succeed. And I don't know where we are with that thinking around run-through medical programs. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think some of the, I think the GMC have just done the survey of, and I think some of the points that you've made, Soraya, are made in that survey as well. I'm not sure when it's embargoed to, so I'll not say any more. Navina.
Thank you. If I pick up Soraya's point around listening to what trainees want, it's captured really well in the strategic framework around, you know, the future of work. So we have got something to build upon as soon as we can use it. So definitely that will be in the work that we do. Coming back to comms and the points that Andrew Foster made, Lee and I, we can go away and look at how we do this. I think we should do this in collaboration now, thinking about my two roles with our partners in NHS England, because there's the facts as we present them, and then there's what it actually feels like for people working in service and what it actually feels like for our ICB leaders and our other leaders. So just telling people, look, we've got so that, you know, sharing the numbers, more of this and more of that, and you're doing all of this is great, but it's not enough. And so we need to think about how we actually listen to the solutions that are there in the service closest to the point of care, and articulate that jointly with them. So Lee, I think if we can pick this up with our partners in NHS England, that would be great. Thank you.
I think you're right, Navina, to capture the lived reality of people as well as the factual reality as well, and combining those in a single narrative, I think, is important. Jo, please.
Yes, thank you. I was going to mention the strategic framework as well, because we set out in there very clearly the current shape of the workforce. And you're right, Andrew, the workforce has grown by about 20% since 2010. That is really significant growth, but unfortunately demand has risen even faster, so that's why it doesn't feel like it. So we try and set that out in the report in terms of why the volume definitely has increased, but it doesn't feel like that to our staff, and also that the public and the patients and our staff want a different nature of care, experience of work, and indeed education, and we need the trick is to pull off all of those three. So in terms of communicating that, I'm hoping that the first chapter, which sets out the shape of workforce, where we're coming from, actually does that. But crucially saying, where do we want to get to? And all the work that Wendy and Mark have led on the reform, because what's really clear from both the patients, users, carers, and our future and current staff is people want more, yes, but also very different experience of care and work, as Soraya said. And unless we tackle the shape of work, we won't be able to improve the shape of care, and education is a key enabler of both those two. And regardless of publications, Navina said in her chief executive report, we're sharing this information now with ICB. We've got a slide deck and summaries because the process is more important. In my experience, a publication very rarely changes the world, but it's conversations like these that can move things forward.
Okay, Jo, thank you. So if we just try and draw this together, I think there is a need to connect the conversation we had in the private board meeting where Richard Meddings joined us for that conversation and this agenda, particularly about signature reforms. And I think there is a connection between Wendy and Mark, what you set out in the slide deck with that narrative as well. I think it also connects to the point that Jo has just made about the strategic framework, which we will publish. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty at the minute, but once that uncertainty has been removed, which it will as we go through this year, we can actually get that document out connected to the long-term workforce plan. And I think both of those are part one and part two of the same document, basically, about setting out a strategic plan for the workforce. Which increasing the quantity will be part, that is a point that you've made, Jo, but also reforming the way we educate and train people is also a part. And I think it's important to keep those two narratives running together quite frankly. That is the more indifferent part, which is why the stuff in here about medical apprenticeships, medical associates programs, some of the work we've done on advanced clinical practice, trainee nurse associates, all forms part of the solution. And I think our narrative needs to be about that. And it's that narrative we need to get out there. And I think to ICB chairs, and I'm not sure sending a slide deck out is the right way to get that, but there is a narrative in there. I think the point Andrew was making to chairs and chief execs of ICBs, and I think we should think about the comms. It's not just what we send to the HSJ or to other places, it's what we send to the people who are out there on the ground actually designing both the current and the future plans for workforce is important. But I think we talked on the back of the annual report, which we approved at our last board meeting, I think. Was it the last one or the one before that? Time advances, about whether there was an infographic that picked up on some of the points that Andrew Foster has made about what the reality is just in terms of the numbers. And actually, I would like to see that infographic get out there and be made available again to chairs and chief execs, to some of the think tanks and others, so it can begin to inform the narratives, because that is the reality. There are more people in training than there ever have been. Mark's made the point about just the numbers joining undergraduate nurse training. Our year-on-year advances over the past 3 years to, what is it, Mark, about a 26% increase. We've had an earlier conversation about an additional 1,500 doctors going into generalism, etc., etc. So these are stories that need to be told in a repetitive and in a concerted and coherent way, in my view, because they also reflect the reality of the work that is being undertaken. And we should be humble about that. It isn't enough. It's not keeping pace, but we should also talk about what we have managed to contribute to and take forward as well. So if I can ask Navina, for you and the exec team, just to give some thought about how we can take that forward, particularly to ICS and ICB chairs and chief executives. I think that will be really, really important. So let me draw that bit to a close. This is work in progress, and with let's keep seeing this work as it develops and grows over this period of time. But Wendy and Mark and your respective teams, you've both called out different of your colleagues that are working on this. Thank you for that continued work. So Callum, let's come to the work that you and your team has been doing. I don't know whether we've got Hazel and Alex with us, but Hazel and Alex, you're very welcome. But Callum, let me invite you to take us through this. And I'm thinking about 20-25 minutes for this agenda item, if that works, Callum. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You preempted my question. Thank you, Chair. OK, so the paper, we have 2 papers here. The first one is how we are approaching essentially planning for the next 2 years ahead, and then a secondary paper around our developments in relation to our ICB statements. I'm happy to perhaps just talk to both of those and then open it up to questions given time. So how do we approach planning? So I think the first point to make is that you must remember that we had a 3-year spending review settlement a year ago, and we're now enacting the first year of that. The year 2 and year 3 are part of the overall Department of Health settlement. HEE does not yet know its share of that for the next 2 years. So we've only got funding certainty for to the end of this financial year. So this is about how do we nail down what needs to happen in the next 2 years. And obviously, with all the other changes and so forth, this is really important. I'm very grateful to Hazel and colleagues across both HEE, NHSC and DHSC for helping come up with the plans that I'm going to talk through, because we've certainly done this in a very collaborative way. And this is primarily driven by the activity. We then obviously put the money against that, but we start with the necessary activity. And that is, we're going about this in 2 ways. And I think that's drawn out in the paper. Essentially, there's two phases to this process. And why are we doing that? Well, the first phase, we've been asked by NHS England to try and set out what the service can expect ahead of it starting its planning round in the autumn, which is October onwards. We're expecting that to start. So we've been asked to say, kind of essentially set out the baseline position ahead of that, so that could be factored in, and also I think it's to get some certainty over the current position, because as I say, we don't know at the moment what happens from the end of this financial year. So essentially there's two phases. One is the sort of what I call a baseline number crunching, working out the activity that we've been committed, and that includes all the good work around growing undergraduate medical numbers, having more GP trainees, honouring the growth in clinical courses that has been recruited to by the education sector, etc. So all of that will be built in. We crunch the numbers around that, and we're trying to agree that the funding for that in phase one, and that essentially we expect to complete. But we expect to have done our work by the end of August, and then obviously it needs to go to ministerial and Treasury approval in September. But hopefully we can get that done, and then we're ready to be public about that baseline plan in October to assist the service in its planning. So that's the phase one, which is important, but clearly our ambition goes beyond that. But I think we have to remember, of course, there are a number of other really important initiatives taking place: the workforce strategic framework, the long-term workforce plan, all of which are running to a longer time frame. So whilst we're working with those initiatives, we don't expect those to be concluded by the end of August. Therefore, we will need to keep our options open as to kind of whether there are any strategic developments coming from that work that will need to be factored in. And there's some risk associated with that. We see that we do phase one, and that seems to be that's it. But clearly, we will need to be very clear that this is based on the assumptions of just continuing the activity levels we've got and the growth that we've already got baked into our plans. Anything beyond that will have to be discussed as a separate adjustment beyond that. So we've got these two phases. Clearly, that second phase will be dictated by long-term workforce plan and those other initiatives that I've talked about, because until those are clear, we can't draw a line under this. So that is a little bit more complicated than it would normally be, but it is by necessity, and it is for good reason. So that is essentially, I think, perhaps the key point really to get across. The paper does talk about some other really important factors, though. I think I'd particularly highlight the education and training planning objectives that we've set out. So clearly we need to link this into these other service workforce financial planning activities that I've talked about. We're really keen to get a greater local priority reflection of local priorities into plans as well. And what we call the METIP, the multi-professional education training and investment planning process, is we're increasingly trying to get that informed by regional and system conversations that our regional directors and their teams are doing. And they actually we build up plans from the data and the what they're telling us. We prioritise resources, of course, for not just the short term. We've got to think about the long term. We've got to also think about reform. We've just heard a lot about that from Wendy and Mark, and these plans very much are in sync with the reforms that we've been talking about. And also, of course, not only the education training reforms, but the funding reforms as well. We've introduced this year some quite significant funding reforms. Our intention is to honour those and not fiddle with them for the next 2 years to again provide certainty. And I think that's an important principle. So there are, as I say, there are some risks associated with this, which I've again set out at the bottom of the paper. The affordability is clearly a risk because the Department of Health has pretty much a flat cash settlement. I obviously don't know all the parts that the Department of Health are having to manage within that, but clearly there, you know, we're going to have to face some difficult issues around affordability compared with the commitments we have made. We'll need to work that through. I've talked about the fact that strategic developments from long-term workforce plan won't be reflected in the first phase of this work, and we just need to be very clear about saying that when we talk about it. And of course, timelines for approval here are always difficult given lots of other things going on. As I say, we're hoping to get this, be able to be public about the first phase of this by the end of September, but we'll just have to take that through, and obviously we will keep you updated as we progress. So those are the key points around METIP and planning that I wanted to say, and I think that's probably the main gist of what I want to talk about. However, I think it's quite useful to be able to talk about the second paper, which is around our ICB statements. And I think we've talked about this at this board previously. This is really an update on what we have done and what we continue to do in this area. I remain really committed to ICB statements, which, if you remember, are a statement we provide for each system, which sets out not just the funding, but also the activity that underpins that funding. And the idea is to be able to show that for the years past, but also looking forward now as well. And it feels like this is really the right time for this now, with ICBs now being statutory bodies. And we're really keen that they now play a much more active role in the planning process. We know decisions will have to be taken more effectively locally where possible. This gives them a lot of key data alongside the workforce data that our workforce colleagues provide to those systems to help them plan. So we're about to, we're just in the process of releasing the next batch of ICB statements. As the paper says, our major focus is around the comms and engagement for the ICB statements. If we're going to be honest, they have been there for a year or two now, but have not been heavily used. But I think now, as I say, is the time where people will see the need to engage with these, and we're doing quite all our focus is around trying to do that via our regional teams, making the connections with ICB leaders and the systems. So that's the major point. We've also made some improvements in reflecting some audit findings. We had an audit done to see what we could do to improve these statements and our process for producing those. We've addressed those, and we've got some automation developments as well to make it a bit easier to produce. But really, that's a fairly quick update. Obviously, I'm happy to take questions about the ICB statements, but I think the main focus, and I'm really interested in everyone's views around the multi-professional education, training and investment plan.
Callum, really clear presentation. Thank you. Can I just invite you and Rob to do a double act around integrated planning and just the point that we've discussed in different fora on this board about how we align service, finance and workforce planning, and what some of the opportunities are as we go forward, and particularly as you're engaging in this tripartite conversation between DH, the new NHSE and HEE in our final year, because I think it's possibly worth just drawing that out for anybody who's able to join this board or who's watching the recording back as well. But I think it'd be good if we just had some reflections, some brief reflections from you and Rob on the work that you've been doing to draw together service, finance and workforce planning.
Well, shall I just quickly say a word, and I'll hand over to Rob. So in terms of quantum, as I've alluded to, in terms of the METIP and the funding that goes with that, a vast majority of it is essentially dictated by what we committed to last year, the year before, because training takes time. It comes through a pipeline and it takes time. However, there is always the 10, 15, 20% extra that there is a degree of discretion over, and that should be dictated by a number of things. It needs to take into account the not just the money available, but also what is obviously going on in service at that time. But it also needs to critically think about what's going to be going on in service in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, 15 years' time, and beyond. And that is the challenge. This is a very complicated process to map all these things together at this point in time, but also project forward, because we are training for the future and we're thinking about the workforce of the future, not just the immediate liquidity, but the long-term solvency of the workforce. So that is the challenge. Now, I think integrated planning is the title we give for trying to achieve this. And it's critical that happens with the service, with NHSE and the Department of Health. We're clearly going in the right direction on that. We work incredibly closely with them now in terms of achieving that, and we will do so increasingly in the new organisation. But I will hand over to Rob, and he will perhaps add his expert perspective on this.
Thank you, Callum. No, I'm going to repeat so it's great to see that we're adopting these ideas as a board and not just something that sits with our function. I think I'd probably stress a couple of things. So the basic bit of integrated planning is that we need to integrate with service and financial planning. But how you do that for different time horizons is really key, because clearly we know our service allocations are 2025, but we don't know it beyond it. And we get nervous if we say we need to do workforce planning aligned to affordability rather than need. So there are some moving parts in there that we need to manage in terms of different timeframes. But integrating with service and financial planning is really key and has to be led by service and financial planners. Workforce planning can't be the tail wagging the service and financial dog here. And what I'm encouraged at is the extent to which service and financial planners are getting that. On the back of our experience through the pandemic and the reality about workforce as an absolute constraint to delivery and all the rest of it, we have interest from groups that aren't from the traditional workforce community. And so sponsorship from Julian and people like that has been fantastic and something we need to build on. Callum is then right that we need to apply that general theory to quite a complex landscape that is defined by time, by level, and by lens. And by lens, I mean place, pathway, or profession. So it's a big, ugly matrix, David. And people like picking off bits of it, but we need a coherent and comprehensive approach because they're all linked. Future workforce is the sum of today's workforce. And what I like is that the fact that the strategic framework work and the long-term workforce plan work gives us a really clear steering commission to achieve that at national level. But what we really need is for the ITS 5-year plans and annual operating planning of providers all to be part of the same continuum. That they're not discrete planning exercises, they're all part of a single piece. And then the punchline of doing some of that diagnosis is you then need to act. There's no point having a diagnosis if you don't act. And then we come into our all levers at all levels thing, David, because the levers to affect workforce are not held by a single entity. You can't sit there and wait for a magic bullet. It's more what about the robots phrase. People sit back and say, oh, but what about the robots? Yes, robots, but what about being a good employer? What about the training pipeline? What about appropriate and ethical international recruitment? And aligning all those pieces is with just integrated planning as our kind of label for it. And we are getting good traction with a lot of people not from a traditional workforce space, is what I would say.
Yeah, and really helpful from both of you. So Navina, you had your hand up earlier. Do you want to come in on this point?
I just wanted to ask Callum if you are able to elaborate a little bit and share with the board how we're working now with the NHS England colleagues in finance in terms of how they're working with integrated care boards and negotiating business with integrated care boards and where our work feeds into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've worked with Julian Kelly and Strategic Finance at HSE for the last couple of years on our funding negotiations, and they've always been incredibly supportive. And this year is a great case in point where actually NHS England has agreed to fund a significant number of new activities in our budgets for this year, and we're just really keen to build on that. Julian is actually, you know, is very supportive of what we do. Very keen that we do have an honest discussion about this. We don't fiddle with rates and things like that to pass pressures to providers. We've been able to make sure that we build in inflation to our assumptions. That's obviously a risk in the current climate, but that's a really important principle that I think shows NHS England's and Julian's commitment to do it, going about this in the right way. And as I say, you know, the whole reason we're kind of tackling the approach this year, rather than sort of waiting for everything to happen, Julian has been really clear that he wants us to be able to set out at least this sort of agree a baseline position early on, and that will assist the clarity and enable the systems and providers to plan better for the year ahead. And of course, yeah, the 5-year plans that ICBs are working on, we can use our the education training statements that I've talked about to inform that work, and we can now if we get 2 years mapped out, that will be a good start to those plans, and then obviously the strategic work ongoing will be able to inform the longer term as well. So I think we're already very joined up. And I think we've got a really exciting opportunity to work with the ICBs. These plans will improve. I'm absolutely certain these plans can be improved much more the more we can build in the ICB perspective into them, and we're well geared up to doing that.
Okay, I think I am going to move us on. Soraya, come in, please, and then I'll move us on. We've got a lot to get through to 1:30, but it was important that we had that conversation, and Callum and in particular, but with Rob and Navina, were able to spell that out. Soraya, please.
No, it's just really to build on Navina's point, and I just wondered whether we've done an assessment for our own capacity to support ICBs in some of this work, so that we are aligned. Obviously, the ICB maturity will be different nationally. Just a bit on that would be helpful.
I'll just quickly come in on that. I think the answer to this one, Soraya, is very much around the work that will go into building the new organisation. Clearly, the interim is difficult. We're just going to, I think we have to manage with what we have. But our regional teams are very much, they see their job as about supporting the systems and working with them. So they will be actually bringing all the resource they can to achieve that. And nationally, we're doing everything we can to try and get the data and the resources in place, such as these statements that I've talked about, to assist. Clearly, it's going to be difficult, but the design of the new NHS England is going to put ICBs at the centre of that, and I'm confident that will get us to a really good place around that.
I think it's very variable, isn't it? Going to these dinners we're having with the HEIs and the ICB leads, it's really interesting to watch how those relationships have developed and grown. You've got some regions with, 4 or 5 ICBs, and you've got others with 11, 12, 13. So it's very lumpy. But your question, Soraya, about capacity, I think is the key one. You can only develop the relationships if you've got the capacity to do it. Rob.
Yeah, it's a little chicken and egg, David. As you've said, we've worked with some ICSs, ICBs that are really thinking carefully about their 5-year planning and had started doing workforce planning for it in advance of any kind of process, and others haven't. And it's that kind of you don't know what you don't know type thing. There's a really good tool that our people directorate colleagues were developing around the people operate model, using a SWIM methodology to say where are you against these different areas of capacity. And then we have been making our data more available at ICS and provider level, almost exponentially through something called ePortal. So if you want the numbers that go with your position, it's now more readily available to you than it's ever been. And that's only a step, but it's an important part, because otherwise you'll go off and try and reinvent it yourself.
Yeah, and I should just quickly chip in just to emphasise the point that Hazel's just made in the comments is that we she's actually working as part of the team supporting NHS England in coming up with the planning guidance. So we really are kind of keeping this all joined up, and you know, every opportunity we can to work with NHS England, we are taking it, and it's really great to be doing that in that collaborative way.
Okay, listen, I'm going to draw that aspect to a close. I think this is tremendous work, Callum, Hazel. We've not invited you to speak. I see you in the chat box, but thank you for the work that you're doing, Alex Glover as well. I think on this comms thing, it's not just about articles we publish. It's about a constant flow of information to keep these issues visible amongst the myriad of issues that ICB chairs, chief execs, chief finance officers are dealing with. I would just ask you to give some thought to whether you send the ICB paper that we've got here to chairs, chief execs and chief finance officers, just as a way of saying, you know, they won't all read it, but 66% of them will read it. And actually that's 66% that will know more about what we're planning to do and how we're trying to do it. So I would just ask us to think about, as we push to greater transparency, which is one of your themes, Callum, and has been for the past 4 years, that we continue that and share the information that we've got and what our plans are. So I'd encourage that. I think the issue on planning is hugely important. I think the autumn has a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability about it, quite frankly. And I think being agile as we begin to get the alignments with the various planning initiatives is going to be key. So as we think about this, there's an awful lot of things going to happen over the summer and into the autumn, which we're going to have to adjust to and take account of. So I think the way that you're positioning this work on alignment and integrated planning is absolutely spot on in my mind. So again, really encouraging to get these reports. So well done, Rob, Callum, Hazel, and your respective teams in the work that you're undertaking here. It's a real opportunity, I think, to think differently about workforce strategically and financially as well. So it's a great opportunity. So thank you. Right, let's go at a gallop. So we've got the grad and student placement scheme, where there's a background report here. I'm not sure who's presenting this. Sam, is it that's Sam with us, or is it?
Sorry, Chair. David, it's me, but only because Sam's got COVID, so she's asked me to do it on her behalf. Okay. So I've got a couple of slides here, and we've got a couple of members of our past graduate team. So how long would you like for this agenda item?
On the basis that the transition and the performance reports we can do in half an hour. And so I'm going to take them as read and not ask for presentations of them, just questions. You can take your 20 minutes.
Super, thank you very much indeed. So just to say, this graduate scheme was in existence way before I joined the organisation. In fact, whilst it does sit within my directorate, I have very little to do for it. It's managed by other colleagues, and it's managed incredibly ably. And we also use some of our past graduates to work on the programme as well. So I think it's a really fantastic initiative that is firmly positioned as part of HEE's approach to talent management, making sure that we've got young talent coming into the organisation, making sure that we're diversifying our organisation, and ensuring that we retain that talent at the other side of the placement. So it's a mixture of, excuse me, placement students that come here for a while and then go back to university, and those that have finished their graduate studies and then come to us. And the retention stats are actually really good. I can see that Jack has put his camera on, and we've got a couple of other colleagues with us who we've managed to land into places and doing really fantastic work and at the future of our organisation and as we transition into our new organisation. The stats, I think, for this year are 50% retention, and we're still working on the other 50%. And I think in previous years, it was up to 80%. So it's great that our graduates are coming, getting great experience with us. And actually, we're benefiting from their wisdom and that experience and landing them in the organisation. They're supported by the Best Place to Work Programme Management Office. They organise inductions and buddy systems. So I won't take words away from our past graduates we've got here, but my sense is, and from what I've heard from people, is that they feel very well supported and well managed to make that transition from university into the workplace, and are therefore able to really substantially contribute to our organisational agenda. Could I have the next slide, please, Matt? Thank you. You can see here from stats, the lonely one in 2018, up to 35 colleagues that we have with us this year in 2022. And I think that speaks to the desire of our managers and our leaders to give our students really great experience, and the desire of us as an organisation to bring in young, fresh talent, fresh eyes. I think intergenerational diversity is so important in an organisation to get that check and challenge of the way that we're thinking. And in fact, we had that experience in our Equality and Diversity Steering Group just this week. One of our graduates, Daniel, did a wonderful presentation, which has been part of his studies, and we all learnt a lot. And we think that what he brought to us is something that we can integrate into our thinking on equality, diversity, and inclusion. So there's an example just here this week. Next slide, please. Our graduates come from all over our organisation. As I say, full credit to our leaders for seeing this as an opportunity, both to give opportunities to graduates, but also to benefit from their wisdom. So it's not centred in certain parts of our organisation, and you can see there the full breadth and spread. In fact, we've got Matt here, who was one of the managers who has had graduates in his team, and we've also got Kristin that I'm going to hand over to in just a second. Next slide, please. And you can see here Matt's quote, about the benefit of having a graduate within his organisation. And Kristin, I think you're going to come in and just talk about your management perspective. And then we're going to hand over to three colleagues. We're going to hand over to Jack, to Belle, and to Jess to give us their own words on their experience and how we're feeding their experience into our ongoing learning. So, Kristin, over to you, if I might.
Thank you, Vicky. Hi, everybody. I'm Kristin O'Leary. I'm Head of Leadership Communications at HEE. And I've been really fortunate to have three grads in my team since the scheme has come into place. One of whom is Belle Young, who's here today. And I feel really lucky that she's now a permanent member of my team. So just to say a few words, Belle joined my team when we were going through a very busy period. We were preparing for the arrival of our new Chief Exec, Navina. And really, to say Belle hit the ground running when she first started working with me is an understatement. Within weeks, the sort of tasks she was involved in was drafting content for speeches, interviewing colleagues internally who wanted to share their stories around some really difficult issues such as mental health, racism, care and responsibilities as part of our EDI comms. But I think the one thing that really struck me with Belle and the other graduates that I've worked alongside, including Jack and Jessica, is the sense of responsibility and ownership that they carry in every task they take on. And I say that's no matter how big or small. So I have really a strong feeling that, I don't see them ever passing the buck. They really follow up on actions, facilitate conversations to resolve issues. And then, where it's necessary, they will escalate. And before I did bid for another graduate, after Belle came into the role, I spent quite a lot of time chatting to colleagues from the 2020 cohort about how I could ensure my new appointee really got the most out of the scheme. And the advice was clear from everyone that I spoke to. And it was this: it was offer tasks that will be challenging and trust them to get on with it. And sure enough, Taylor, who's now in my team, got her teeth into projects such as leading a sustainability campaign, developing a new series of interviews with our non-exec directors, many of whom have been involved in doing interviews for our leadership series, and attending conferences with our chair, Sir David Bean, and subsequently producing things like blogs. So, I always say to other managers who are looking to take on a grad is give graduates the opportunity to absorb themselves in the business of the organisation, so they can see how HE works and how we're having an impact out there in the real world. So things like encouraging them to come to spend some time with trainees, shadowing at decision-making meetings such as board, and spending time with senior leaders. So attending Navina's regular coffee morning, for example. So yeah, that's really all I wanted to say. But, you know, we know that securing a grad role is not easy. And I think